Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another event with the Noonan Carnegie Library. We're so excited to have you here. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to keep their microphones muted during the interview portion of tonight's evening. Don't forget to check out our website, thenoonan-carnegie.com, Facebook, our Instagram, our YouTube pages for more online Carnegie content and to keep updated on all future programs. You can sign up for our mailing list on Facebook. Just look at the menu and under More, just click Join My List and follow the prompts. Tonight's presentation, Sacred or Heretical, Banned Books and Religion, is being hosted by the University of West Georgia's very own Dr. Beth Sheppard. Take it away, Dr. Sheppard.
All right, thank you very much, Anthony. I really appreciate this invitation to join the Noonan Carnegie Library and all the good folk in Noonan. I hope you're all safe. And I want to wish anybody who might be Jewish who is joining us a wonderful feast day. We'll get a little bit to that in a moment here. Let me share my screen and let you know the agenda. All right, our overview today, we're going to talk a little bit about Yom Kippur because it is today the high holy day of Yom Kippur. I'll give some information theory on banned books at large since this is Banned Book Week. In the middle of that, we'll have a moment where I say a word or two about the printing press and its role in religious publishing. My own specialty at my doctorate is in Gospel of John. My doctorate's in New Testament studies. So when I'm going to talk a little bit of examples, they're going to be primarily religious examples relating to the formation of the New Testament. And then finally, since it is Yom Kippur today, I will talk a bit about banned books by Jewish authors. All right, so what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is the highest of most sacred religious holidays in Judaism, just like in Christianity, although Christmas is the most popular holiday in a way. Easter is the holy holiday of the Christian liturgical year. So too is Yom Kippur the most sacred day in Judaism. And the reason why we selected the theme, sacred books and heretical books, is because today is Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur began at sundown yesterday and will end at sundown today. And for those who are not familiar with Yom Kippur is literally the Day of Atonement. And I've got a whiteboard here. I can actually scribble out. So, this is the word Yom. This is a yod and a mem, which means day. And Kippur, Kippur would be K-P-U-R, Yom Kippur. Hebrew is written from right to left, and it has a square script. So if you actually had a grid with little squares in it, the letters would fit in the squares. So like an aleph, the first letter of the alphabet would fit perfectly in the square. So it's called a square script. So Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is actually linked in the Hebrew Bible and in modern Christianity to be inclusive to Judaism. Rather than calling the Old Testament, we often call it the Hebrew Bible because it is written in Hebrew and it is common to both Christianity and Judaism. But to Jews, it isn't old, it is their Bible. So it's based on a passage from Leviticus, and Yom Kippur is from Leviticus 16. And in the days of the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, but when there was the temple in Judaism that was established and presided over by Aaron, these were the instructions. Aaron shall offer a bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And then what he's going to do is he's going to sacrifice a bull, sacrifice one of the goats, and go into the section of the temple called the Holy of Holies and purify it using the blood of the goats to purify that section of the temple. The temple, let me get my little whiteboard here. The temple in ancient Judaism was set up kind of like a Russian nesting doll. And so you had, if this was the whole temple, can we see that? You have the courtyard of the Gentiles. So anybody who is not Jewish can be out here in this outer room. And then you have the courtyard of women. So women can be in this section. And then you have the courtyard of the men. So they can be in this section. And then you have the courtyard of the priests. And in the very center, you've got the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies could only be entered once a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And at that point, the high priest would go in and basically clean it and purify it with a little bit of blood, because they felt the blood purified in that period of time. And I mentioned there were 2 goats. What did they do with the second goat? Well, one goat they kept out here, and the other goat they killed and used part of its blood. But this is the interesting thing, because this will be a little bit of fact here, you might know. The other goat, when Aaron had finished atoning for the holy place, he presented the live goat, and then he laid both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confessed over it the iniquities. And here you get the Day of Atonement. They're confessing their sins to the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting their sins on the head of the goat. And then they sent it away into the wilderness. So this is where we get the term scapegoat, because the symbolic sins of the people that were being atoned for on the Day of Atonement were put on the goat and sent out in the wilderness. And that's how we get scapegoat. Yeah, that's a little fact if you're ever curious. Today, because the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the Day of Atonement is celebrated in synagogue as a fast day. Folk will eat a really big meal the night before the Day of Atonement, and then on the Day of Atonement not eat at all. And there are 5 services of prayer in synagogues, and instead of the usual 3 that you would normally have on a Sabbath. So there are extra services of prayer and repentance on the high Day of Atonement. So that's a little bit about the Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement. A little bit about banned books theory. It's very likely that some members of my classes at University of West Georgia have joined us. If so, welcome. You may have seen this graphic in a slightly different color form before, but basically every book goes through a cycle where the author creates it, the publisher disseminates it, a library or a bookstore organizes it. They put it on the shelf so people can find it and either buy it or check it out. It gets cataloged in a bookstore. It gets entered in the inventory system in a library. It gets entered into the online catalog. It gets used. People read it. It gets preserved. Classic books end up going into archives, or they figure out a way to put on a special dust jacket if the paper cover starts coming apart, or they glue it together if it gets a cracked spine. They preserve it. And then ultimately, every piece of information gets destroyed. The book gets too old to use, or they come out with a second edition, or with time, people just forget it existed and it goes up into garage sales, and eventually nobody reads it anymore. Nobody even recalls that XYZ book was published. It's essentially lost. every bit of information ultimately gets destroyed, no matter how hard you try to preserve it. Even a cemetery tombstone that has an inscription, eventually the elements will wear off somebody's name. If you've got a marble tombstone and you've looked at a tombstone that's about 200 years old, you'll find out it's very hard to read the name. That information is gradually being destroyed by the elements. So in BAM books, though, what we have is an attempt to shortcut the process, where from the point of time where it is organized, people try to prevent it from being used and preserved, and they try to move it directly to that destroyed mode. And there are main reasons. This is Butler University and Fort Lewis College have come up with the main reasons that books are banned. Racial issues. I have in my office a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Let me see if I got my version of To Kill a Mockingbird is actually inscribed by Harper Lee. I worked in a library in Illinois and worked with Harper Lee's pastor to obtain some material from Harper Lee for our book archives. And to thank me personally, Harper Lee provided not only a signed copy for our archives, but she provided for me a personal copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. But because it's got racial issues and sexual issues, it's about a rape case, it is often a banned book. The rape case would also classify it as a damaging lifestyle. Books that are considered to be things that don't have a wholesome lifestyle, so they portray criminal acts or they portray things that people think are immoral lifestyles, are sometimes banned. Blasphemous dialogue or profanity. If someone in a character in a book swears, they can be banned. Sexual situations or dialogue, violence or negativity, witchcraft. The Harry Potter book is often held up as the paradigmatic example of a book that is banned because of witchcraft. Unpopular or minority religions can be banned, and we'll see one example of how this works with one of the Jewish authors toward the end of this presentation. Political bias can cause a book to be banned. If a political party is in power, particularly in a state that is a dictatorship, like the country presently of Belarus with Lukashenko, he could, in theory, declare books that portray him or politics of his country in an unfavorable light. He could actually add them to a banned book list. Or books are banned because they're considered to be age inappropriate. So of those issues, the ones in red are the ones that tend to be associated with religious reasons, so a damaging lifestyle. There are certain religious groups, for example, that are not okay with abortion. So if a book would portray abortion on religious grounds, the pro-life movement might see that as a damaging lifestyle and might ban a book like that. The religious profanity, taking the Lord's name in vain, witchcraft, or minority religion. So a lot of the reasons for banning a book really relate to religious culture or religious themes or religious-based ideologies. At heart, religious-based banning of books is lack of trust. The person who is banning the book does not trust the reader's ability to think critically about the book, or the reader's ability to understand the genre, or they don't expect that the reader has an adequate foundation of their own faith to be able to interpret it correctly. So an example of this is the Da Vinci Code, which was written by Dan Brown, and it's very clearly a work of fiction. It's a kind of adventure novel, spy novel, intrigue novel about the Catholic Church and a particular group. But along the way, in this fiction novel, they mention that Jesus actually did marry Mary Magdalene and had progeny with that children, and folk who worry and mix up fiction and nonfiction think that, oh, people reading that book will think that Jesus really did marry Mary Magdalene. Boy, this is a mouthful. Mary Magdalene. but that's assuming the reader can't understand the difference between fiction and nonfiction. They also worry that readers who are Christian might not know or might not have read the New Testament in its entirety and might not know that while Jesus attended the wedding of Cana in Galilee, it was not his own wedding. There's no written evidence that Jesus actually was married. It's kind of a silent piece. They don't talk at all about Jesus dating or anything like that. All right. Which brings me to printing presses. Printing presses were essentially devised in order to promote religiosity. The idea that people don't know their faith. Once you've got printing presses up and going, you can print Bibles so they can read their press. And it's no surprise then that when Gutenberg first published, he published a Bible. Catechism is basically lessons on how to learn the faith or lessons about the faith. A church publishing house like the United Methodist Publishing House in Abingdon Press in Nashville, DC, or Nashville, Tennessee, or the Presbyterian Publishing House, which is known as John Knox Press. They are modern publishing houses that publish materials for their denominations. And not only do they publish some really good things that anybody can read about Bible and Bible information, but they actually publish Sunday school materials to be used to educate people in what it means to be a Presbyterian versus a Methodist. Methodists, for example, believe in free will. Presbyterians, by contrast, believe that God predestines us to eternal salvation or eternal damnation. By contrast, the Lutheran Publishing House, which is Concordia Publishing, would publish things about sin, because Lutherans are very focused on the role of sin and guilt and forgiveness in Christianity. So those would be works that were associated. So anyway, in the 15th century, publishers were concerned about publishing religious materials, and that is primarily what came off of the early presses. Inspirational works like The Pilgrim's Progress, which is by John Bunyan, and Judaism too was publishing religious presses. There was a religious press set up by Abraham Ben Hayin de Tintore. Oh, if you see the word Ben, like Ben Gurion Airport or or the word Ben in a Hebrew name. The word Ben means son. So Abraham, son of Hayan di Tintore. Just like we have Isaacson, son of Isaac. So if you see the word Ben, you know it means son. If you see Michael Cohen, Kohen is a Jewish word for priest. Usually families that Jewish families that trace their descent from priests and rabbis may take or may have the last name of Cohen or Kohen. The very first Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy was published in Hebrew with that square script in 1482. Oh, incidentally, if you see the dots in Hebrew, it's just Hebrew sometimes is printed. So this would be Kohen without dots. They tend to put the dots and the lines are the vowel pointings, and those are the vowels. And oftentimes Hebrew texts that appear on signs, if you go to Israel and visit, they would just print on a billboard the letters that are the consonants. You wouldn't necessarily see the vowel pointing. So, but this version of the Pentateuch in 1482 actually did include vowel pointing. They added the little vowels, which are assisting readers. This is the photo in this slide is a reproduction Gutenberg printing press. So, sacred books and early Christianity. They now are talking about early Christianity because we're talking about how Christianity isn't an island unto itself, but actually grew up and influenced the Roman world, just as it was influenced by the Roman world. For example, St. Paul was a Roman citizen, and Roman citizen has certain connotations and certain meanings in the Roman world because not everybody was a Roman citizen. So you can see the interplay between the Roman culture shows up a little bit in Paul's life. So when they talk about early Christianity, they're talking about early Christianity that grew up in a context where it was influenced by or reflects and in turn influences the Jewish culture, the Greek culture, in which the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the Roman or Latin culture. The Jewish culture is reflected in strands like the fact that in the 4th gospel, Jesus is called a rabbi, which is a Jewish word, which means teacher. Several times in the Gospel of John, Jesus travels back and forth between Galilee and Jerusalem to attend holy festivals, such as the Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement festival. He would have attended one of those. The formation of the New Testament, when the New Testament was produced, it wasn't in book form. When we think of typical books, we think of pages bound together. This particular Bible is sewn, or they're glued together, and you think of them opening in book form. In actuality, the early Bible was in scrolls. And so the book of Matthew, the book of Mark, the book of Luke, the book of John would be as individual scrolls. They would be written on individual scrolls, and they would circulate individually. One community might have a copy of Mark early on and not a copy of Luke, but the early church in the province across the street might have a copy of that particular text. So they didn't necessarily, books were very expensive, so they might not have a full New Testament in the early days of Christianity. You might have 1 or 2 books. Eventually, what happened was people started gathering the books together. And church leaders tried to determine what of all the various books that were written would be considered sacred as opposed to just inspirational. So, for example, we have a lot of inspired documents in Christianity. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is considered to be inspired, and everybody knows it. The song "Amazing Grace," everybody knows the song "Amazing Grace," but yet they're not added into the New Testament because we talk about our sacred writings, our canon being closed. The word canon basically means the core reading list. And so what ended up happening is gradually, as New Testament books became more and more used, the bishop said, oh, these should be part of the core reading list. These should be part of the core reading list. And it wasn't until the Council of Carthage in 397 CE, and we use the term CE for Common Era as opposed to AD, that the Council of Bishops at Carthage said, this is the list of the books that comprise our final New Testament. Early on, there were other books that could have been included. For example, there was a bishop named Clement who wrote First Clement and Second Clement letters. And some early lists thought that the books of Clement should be included. Some bishops didn't particularly like the book of Revelation. It was pretty scary. And so the book of Revelation was often on not necessarily a banned book list, but let's put that on the inspirational reading list as opposed to the sacred reading list of canon, the recommended, these are the standard books that everybody should read. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense of how the New Testament came together. And so it was a very long process that occurred over 4 centuries. So we talk about canon being the process by which we come up with the standard book list. But there are other books. Heretical books are those that diverge from what is accepted belief. Orthodoxy is that accepted belief, the correct opinion. And confession, some organizations and some churches and some religious groups write confessions. The word confession in Greek is homologia. Homo meaning the same. We have that in the word homogenized milk because the cream and the water in milk are processed so that they no longer separate out, but they're in the same body of liquid. There's one unified milk product. You can tell I grew up on a dairy farm, okay? I got a milk example. But confessions are basically groups of people who say the same thing. And what they're saying is the same thing, is the orthodox or correct opinions that they have come to as the standards for their belief system. Early on in Christianity, there wasn't particularly a standard orthodoxy. There were many, many religions. And if you're part of a Christian group that is interpreting the Bible a particular way, you don't know necessarily that somebody across the country is interpreting it a different way. And eventually some of those interpretations became standard and others of them did not. And those that became non-standard were considered to be heretical, and their writings about those interpretations were considered to be heretical and were suppressed, essentially banned. One of the authors whose works were banned was named Marcion. He was the son of a bishop, and he was living on the shores of the Black Sea. So he was a churchman. He was devout in his faith. But he looked at the Hebrew Bible, or the stories that Christians call the Old Testament, and he looked at the New Testament and he said, oh, this wrathful God of the Old Testament doesn't seem to make sense compared to the good, forgiving, gracious God of the New Testament. Therefore, in my canon, or people who I teach in my church, whom I'm pastoring, I'm going to say you shouldn't read the Old Testament, just focus on the New Testament. So he essentially banned the Hebrew Bible. He banned the Old Testament and said the only Bible you need is the New Testament. Furthermore, he said the only gospel you need is the Gospel of Luke. And the reason why he says that the only reason why we should have the Gospel of Luke instead of Matthew or Mark is because he had a very literal reading of Luke chapter 1, verse 1, where Luke writes, "Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully and from the first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." The name Theophilus means one who loves God, "so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed." And so Marcion looked at that passage and interpreted that to mean that the free-floating scrolls of Matthew, Luke, and John were inaccurate accounts, that Luke was the only one that had an accurate account. And so his Bible basically was Luke and a couple of Paul's writings. Marcion's own book, called The Antithesis, laid out this scheme of what should or shouldn't be read by early Christians. And a church father named Tertullian wrote a response called Against Marcion. So he was writing his own book to refute Marcion. Eventually, the Antithesis became banned, and it is so banned that it's lost. We do not have a copy of the Antithesis. It's lost to history. What we do have is we can kind of reconstruct what it may have said or what it may have argued by reading Tertullian, who is a church father's work against Marcion. So we read what he was arguing against to try to reconstruct what Marcion's point of view. So that's how information, that particular book, The Antithesis, was completely destroyed. All right. Another example of works that were destroyed or banned in early Christianity are works related to Gnosticism. The word gnosis in Greek means knowledge, and Gnostics considered themselves to be Christian. They didn't know they were heretical, just like Marcionites didn't know they were heretical. They thought they were just devout Christians interpreting the world. Gnostics interpreted the word slightly different than what became mainline Christianity. Gnostics felt that Jesus was not fully human or fully divine, God in two natures, as Orthodox Christianity tends to teach, but rather Gnostics believed that Jesus was only divine. He didn't have any human aspects, and he was more like an angel. He was never really human. He was kind of in this middle plane, not fully God, but not fully human, just kind of caught in the middle like an angel. And so that was Christology, how you understand the two natures of Christ, human and divine. And so they had a slightly different version, i.e. that Jesus was not fully human, than what became Orthodox Christianity. They also didn't like the physical realm. They believed that only spiritual spirit or a person's soul was important. In Christianity, both the soul and the body are, in modern day Christianity, or Christianity since the 3rd century, when Gnosticism was put down, was considered both body and spirit were considered good because God created the physical realm as well as the spiritual realm. And so the physical realm is good by virtue of the fact that God created. Gnostics didn't see it that way. They only valued the spiritual realm. And they believed that there was secret knowledge, gnosis knowledge, that would enable you to come to understanding of the evilness of the material world and move forward into faith. And so many Gnostic writings were banned. However, the Gnostics were clever little folk, and occasionally we find small collections of their writings preserved in the desert. The Nag Hammadi codexes were buried in jars in the desert, and the story of how the Nag Hammadi codexes, which are a collection of Gnostic texts, were found were that there was a farmer out spreading nitrates in his field, which is a fancy way of saying he was putting manure on his field, and his camel got his foot in a hole, and when he was trying to get the camel's foot out, he discovered one of the jars that had these texts in that were the Gnostic texts. But anyway, I want to read you one of a small poem, which is called the Song of Ascent, and it was published in what Willis Barstone cleverly called the Other Bible. But the Song of Ascent says, I fly and proceed thither until I reach the watch house of the sun. I cry, who will guide me past the watch house? Your reward, your works, your alms, and your goodness guide you to the watch house. How greatly I rejoice, how greatly my heart rejoices, how much I look forward to the day when my struggle is over, when the day my struggle is over. And my course is set toward the place of life. I hasten and proceed thither until I reach the watch house of the moon. So it's just a portion of the Song of Ascent. And the whole purpose there is the author is looking forward to shedding his earthly body, shedding his human corporeal self, and by the secret knowledge imparted to him, pass by the watch house into a spiritual plane. All right. Since it is Yom Kippur, and it is until sunset today, I did want to acknowledge that there have been some banned books by Jewish authors and talk about 5 in particular. There were 5 that are provided on a list by the Jewish Book Council. And the first is All the Rivers. And All the Rivers was written by Dorit Rabinyan. And it is a story about a Jewish woman who goes to New York City for work purposes, and there in New York City meets a Palestinian man, and they fall in love. And because it's a forbidden love story between someone of the Jewish faith and someone of the Palestinian faith, the Israel Education Authority in Israel banned the book. You have to keep in mind that Israel is not a place where there is separation of church and state. I've been to Israel for my research a couple of times. And the first time I went was in the early 80s, and I was able to get into, at that point, the Knesset, which is essentially the state house, Congress, the Knesset. What I remember from that visit was that the seats were set up in the shape of a menorah. And a menorah, let me get my handy whiteboard. A menorah is the candelabra. Yeah, this is a non-Hanukkah menorah. A Hanukkah menorah has 8 candles, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a shamish, which is a helper candle that helps you light the other candles. A temple menorah from the old ancient temple had 7 flames. And so in the book of Revelation, when they talk about 7 lampstands, it is an allusion to the seven flames of the traditional Jewish temple menorah. Anyway, I can't remember if it was 8 or 7 strands, but the chairs were actually set up in the formation of a menorah. So if you are a Palestinian represented to the Knesset, the Congress, you're actually sitting in the holy symbol of Judaism to govern the country. Those of you who are a little more familiar with more modern Jewish history know that there's been a split. The Jews basically want to get, the conservative Jews are in power and basically want to push Palestinians out of the country and reclaim the land settled by, or claimed by King Solomon. By contrast, the Palestinians have been there, and they believe that, Arabs believe that they are descendants of Hagar, who had a son, Ishmael, by Abraham, and they believe that they have a right to that land as well. Oddly enough, the difference between when I went to Israel in the 80s and when I went recently, I was there in, was it 2017 was my last trip to Israel? I went to Bethlehem both times. And the first time, Bethlehem, you just went into Bethlehem. Since the Palestinian controversies have gotten hot, Bethlehem has been designated as a Palestinian city. And now the Jews have constructed this huge wall that surrounds it. And you have to go through checkpoints to get into the city. And in the city, it's like a ghetto. It's very impoverished. The Palestinians have very few work opportunities because they can't get outside of the city. They're essentially, because they're within, the city of Bethlehem is enclosed within the larger country of Israel. They're kind of stuck in there. And so that's a very traumatic thing to have seen in my own lifetime through history, the ghettoization of Palestine. But anyway, the book, because it has all the rivers, the love affair between a Palestinian and a Jew who meet in New York, is a banned book sometimes in Israel. The next book is Anne Frank, Diary of a Young Girl. And the difficulty with Anne Frank's, she's writing of her experiences isolated with her family in Nazi Germany. And the difficulty is her diary. She's a teenager, 13, 14 years old, I can't remember which, coming of age. And there are some graphic passages as she's trying to describe the physiological changes of her going through puberty. And so she describes some female anatomy. And oftentimes parents of children in school want this book banned because they see the graphic descriptions of female anatomy as inappropriate. Again, it's a question, going back, of trust issues. Remember I said banned books are always an issue of trust. At that point, it's not necessarily trusting the reader, but it's trusting the teacher to be able to unpack and explain and contextualize the content in a way to make it acceptable to young people. So again, banned books is often a question of trust. Do you trust those who are teaching the book? Do you trust those who are reading the book? It's all about trust. Another Jewish book, or a book written by a Jewish author, is Catch-22. And Catch-22 was written by Joseph Heller, and it accounts his experience in World War II and the trauma where he's fighting against the Nazis and he's worried about dying from the Nazis, but also every time his own commanders send him out on a mission, he's starting to hate his commanders because he sees his commanders telling him, go out and risk your life, go out and risk it. So he almost feels like his allied commanders are torturing him. So he's kind of caught between his commanders who want him to go out and fly the missions and the Germans who could kill him. His commanders who are putting him in the death situation just as much as the Nazis who are there wielding the rifles. There is a religious aspect to Catch-22 in that it has several passages about what they call theodicy. Theodicy is the problem of evil. If God is all good and God is all loving and God is all powerful, why do bad things happen? In other words, if life is a bowl of cherries, what am I doing with the pits? The book of Job in the Hebrew Bible is a book that is about a character who is struggling with an all-powerful God who still lets horrible things happen. And because there are passages in Catch-22 where the main character questions God, sometimes there are religious connotations as to why that particular book might be banned. The next on the list, Life Goes On, is actually set and was a book that was written a little bit earlier than Anne Frank in Germany. And it was written in the period between World War I and World War II. And in that particular book, Hans Kielsen, the author, is Jewish. And the Nazis, when they got to power in the 1930s, banned the book because it was written by a Jew. The English teacher, actually, I put on here because it was banned for a reason that is not on any of the lists we talked about. The English teacher is about an undercover Mossad agent who is the Secret Service in Israel, who actually is the main character. And it is written by a person who was an agent in Mossad. And it is so true to life that Mossad and the state of Israel felt it revealed secrets of Israeli spycraft to anybody who picked up the book and would read it as an enemy. And so they suppressed the book for that reason. So anyway, I see we're nearly at the end of our time, and this ends our romp through banned books, heretical and sacred. And thank you for listening. And Anthony, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Sheppard. We really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate your presentation. Thank you very much. And I hope to see everyone back for another Noonan Carnegie presentation.